Paths of Glory comes at a point in Kubrick's career which is actually quite tricky. He had made films up to this point, mostly with private money. He used his own savings, money from his father, from relatives, and he'd only made one film really, which was a professional production, a union film, going by union rules, using working professionals in Hollywood, and that was The Killing. And during the making of The Killing, he made a deal with United Artists that allowed him to think about a follow-up project that might be taken by United Artists. And United Artists, of course, had to be happy with The Killing, and it had to be happy with the project that they would propose as that follow-up film for United Artists. And Kubrick and his partner, James Harris, his business partner, who he had made The Killing with, they were looking around for all kinds of projects, but they settled on this novel from the 1930s by an American writer called Paths of Glory. And United Artists didn't like it. They didn't like the idea, presumably because there was no known market for World War I movies. They had never done particularly well, at least not since the 30s. And also, perhaps the novel itself was quite a tricky piece because it was an ensemble piece. It was telling the story of many different characters during an episode in the First World War. And it didn't lend itself, obviously, to being turned into a Hollywood movie. Now, what happened is that Kubrick and Harris were working on quite a lot of other projects as well in 1955-56. They had joined forces in 1955, and the reason why Harris joined Kubrick was that Kubrick really had been, as I said, mostly self-funding his film or privately funding his films, and he had also been involved in all kinds of aspects of film production, things that maybe a filmmaker should hand over to other people. And Harris saw a chance to collaborate with Kubrick, taking off a lot of roles that Kubrick himself had to fulfill before. And so Harris offered his services as a producer, taking care of a lot of the aspects that would distract, as it were, Kubrick from actually making movies, and to professionalize the whole operation and to attract money, serious money, to the films that Kubrick was going to make. So that was the divide between the two partners. And it is probably worth saying that James Harris was a friend of Kubrick's. So in a sense, his early career, which is dominated by him working with the people he knew from high school, working with his girlfriends, getting money from relatives, it in a sense still continues with the James Harris partnership, because Harris is a friend of a friend. But Harris comes from a family that is in the film business. He has experience, and his family has some serious money. So it's a partnership made in heaven, as it were, combining the professional and the personal. So although Paths of Glory had been rejected by United Artists, Kubrick and Harris had already spent quite a lot of money on the project, because they hired Jim Thompson, the crime writer, not a legendary figure at the time. He was, underemployed, underpaid, a poor writer at the time. He had already published a few novels, but he hadn't made much money with them. So what they did, Harris and Kubrick, first of all, they hired Jim Thompson to write the adaptation of the novel that became The Killing, Clean Break. They also asked Jim Thompson to write a new story, which they might later adapt into a film. And they asked Jim Thompson to work on the script of Paths of Glory. And all of this cost money. United Artists' release of The Killing, which, if we trust their judgment, was mishandled because it was released as part of a double bill rather than being released as a major new crime drama in its own right. It was handled, it was brought out in a wide release as part of a double bill, which Harris and Kubrick thought killed its chances ever to make any money. And indeed, it didn't make any money. So they're in a situation where they desperately need a solid project with a major studio that can fund it. They return to United Artists in order to further negotiate with them whether they may yet get interested in Paths of Glory. And what emerges from these negotiations is that United Artists might be convinced if a major star got involved. And this is when the story gets interesting, and the accounts of the story are slightly confusing. So I'm telling you what I think happened, although there are some other accounts which contradict this. I think what happened is that in order to attract a major star, they needed to convert what was basically an ensemble picture into a star vehicle. So they had to completely rewrite the story. And they had to foreground one particular character who a star might get interested in as the center of the whole story. And that character became Colonel Dax, who is just one of the characters, as likable or unlikable, as effective or ineffective as just about everyone else in the original novel, but he becomes the hero. He's still not a terribly successful hero in achieving his objectives, but he becomes the central character who basically, around whom the whole story is organized. And through that rewrite of the story, they manage to get Kirk Douglas interested. Now, this still causes further negotiations. It doesn't solve the problem, because Kirk Douglas is not necessarily thinking that this is going to be, for example, a big box office hit for him. That's not how he approaches the project. He later, even at the time, and also later, he says, well, I partly did it because I wanted to support these young filmmakers. They seem to be doing good work. They needed some help, so I wanted to support them. That's what he said at the time and later. So he didn't say, I was hoping to be in a great movie, or, this is going to be a box office smash. He thought he was supporting, or at least he said he thought he was supporting these young filmmakers. When you look at what James Harris remembered about the negotiations, a slightly different picture emerges. Because James Harris said that the contract they had to sign with Kirk Douglas's production company, Briner Productions, was quite restrictive. It was not a contract which, in which Kirk Douglas, through his production company, generously supports this project of these young filmmakers, but it was a contract which committed Harris and Kubrick to give what I think one would today call first refusal on 5 projects to Briner Productions after Paths of Glory. So James Harris, I think, said, we were going to work for Kirk Douglas in order to get Paths of Glory made for the foreseeable future. I think there's a lot of stories around the relationship between Kubrick and Kirk Douglas. It seems to me that the working relationship had to have been a good one for Douglas to ask Kubrick to do Spartacus, for Kubrick to take on that job after Spartacus. What happens, it seems, is that Douglas is so grateful to Kubrick that he doesn't require Harris Kubrick Pictures to fulfill their contract with Briner Productions. Harris Kubrick Pictures, the company is free to make any films they want for whoever they want to make them for. Douglas actually later said he lost a lot of money by letting them out of that contract, because the films that Harris Kubrick Pictures, or then once that was dissolved, Kubrick himself made afterwards, were all box office hits. Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clockwork Orange. The intention of making this film, I think very early on, was linked to make it in Europe. Now, why would Hollywood shoot in Europe? One of the reasons was that it was cheaper than shooting in the States. Also, you might get subsidies from the countries in which you shot. Subsidies which were meant to be used for the local film industry, but Hollywood often, by employing personnel from these countries, managed to qualify for subsidies. Also, in some cases, the kind of atmosphere you wanted to evoke, the kind of settings you used for the films, if they had European subject matter, if they were set in Europe, was easier to find in Europe than it was, in the United States. You would have to build a chalet in Hollywood, but in Germany or in France, you could just go there and shoot it. And interestingly, he chose Germany, which is somewhat ironic because the film is about the French army in the First World War, with the German opposition being only a shadowy, never actually seen presence in the film. They used local personnel a lot, below the line personnel. The one exception was that early on there was some concern in the marketing department of United Artists that this was a film with not a single female character in it. And they thought that that might be a problem. Among many other reasons, it was well known in Hollywood, it was well understood that the main audience for films, the cinema-going audience in the United States and indeed elsewhere, were probably women. Women who would bring their husbands and their children along to watch a movie. And it was also understood that women weren't necessarily, their preferred genre wasn't necessarily the war movie, and that women liked to see other women on the screen, and perhaps even some kind of love story. So what happened was that there was some explicit or implicit pressure on the filmmakers, Kubrick and his team, to perhaps make it possible for a woman to at least be featured in the advertising for the film. I'm not sure whether that was the reason, but it's one of the contributing factors, no doubt, that Kubrick decided to add a scene to the film which had no equivalent in the novel. Now, when they were actually making Paths of Glory, there are contradictory stories about which script versions were shown at which point to Kirk Douglas and what his response allegedly was to those. And I am not in a position to settle that question. I've read a lot about it. Kirk Douglas's account, the biographer of Jim Thompson, he has an account of what happened. Richard Daniels, the Kubrick archivist, has written about this to some extent. I think the film finds a very good balance between reproducing the ensemble nature of the original novel and the requirements of having a major Hollywood star with a heroic character in it. I think the Colonel Duck's character is both ultimately completely ineffective. He's completely ineffective. I mean, even at the very end of the film, when he allows the soldiers a few more minutes, but he knows that immediately afterwards they will have to go back to the trenches, to the front, and be, likely eventually be shot to pieces. So I think that sense of the novel, of utter futility, is captured in the film.